Esta primera actividad de este semestre 2025-1. Muy contento de estar aquí con Carol Gil y Claudia Maya, quienes han coordinado este evento. Bueno, pues en este momento el evento se llama POLYCRISES, un MEXICO-U.S. BILATERAL Relationship. Bienvenidas también nuestras invitadas. Em, bueno, va a ser una sesión en inglés. Pues bueno, pues hay tantas aristas en la complejidad en la relación bilateral entre México y Estados Unidos, que pues bueno, pues ellas van a hacer una revisión acerca de de la dificultad para determinar los elementos que son estructurales, entender también cuáles son pues los flujos económicos, monetarios, que están transformando a una velocidad impresionante la diferentes presiones sobre la relación bilateral entre México y Estados Unidos desde una perspectiva financiera. Y por supuesto, pues bueno, las transformaciones que nos están sacudiendo y que las vemos en formas de noticias coyunturales, las vemos en formas eh, como si fueran eventos aislados, pero que pues gracias al trabajo de las doctoras Maya y Gil y de quienes hoy participaban en el evento, pues habrá oportunidad de ir dilucidando, ir mejorando nuestra comprensión de esta difícil situación eh, que no tiene eh, una salida fácil, tampoco previsible, enteramente previsible. Todavía hay muchos factores de riesgo. Así que bueno, pues vamos a estar haciendo esta revisión. Yo quiero agradecerles a Carol y a Claudia la invitación para abrir este evento y ofrecerles una disculpa por llegar corriendo. Pero bueno, pues aquí estamos y pues declaramos inaugurado este evento y les deseamos el mayor de los éxitos. No, very welcome to our visitors. We are very happy to have you here at CESAN. It's great that you come here to make this discussion and to enrich the discussion here. And we're very happy to have you here. So thank you very much. Gracias a quienes aquí están y pues sin más, le doy la palabra a la doctora Claudia Maya.
Muy buenos días a todos. Agradecemos su presencia en el CISAN, que nos acompañen en esta sala, Mónica Berea, y también queremos agradecer a los que nos ven a través de las redes, aquí y fuera más allá de las fronteras. Damos pues las gracias principalmente a la UNAM por tener acceso a todo este conocimiento. Damos gracias al CISAN por proveernos toda la facilidad, las facilidades, el poder organizar el evento, así como a Redefim y al AFI por el apoyo. Bueno, pues la intención de este evento, como ya lo mencionó el doctor Barrón, es tratar de acercarnos a las distintas crisis que está presentando la región de América del Norte y cómo estas crisis, en particular en Estados Unidos, cambian la relación bilateral México-Estados Unidos. Entonces, esperemos que aprendamos mucho. Tenemos invitados de lujo. Tenemos aquí a dos profesoras que nos acompañan, una de la Universidad de Buffalo, otra de la Universidad de Jordan. Muy bien. Más allá, también nos acompaña el doctor Randall Ray, quien ha sido nuestro gran profesor y quien va a ser el note speaker, por muchos conocido porque es el creador, o bueno, uno de los fundadores de la teoría moderna del dinero, y va a estar dando a mediodía él en la conferencia magistral. Finalmente tendremos una mesa que español-inglés, no hay problema si no entienden totalmente inglés. Vamos a tener una mesa donde vamos a abordar los problemas desde una visión del sur global. Entonces, todos sean bienvenidos a este seminario. Lo hacemos, es un esfuerzo conjunto, distintas universidades, distintos académicos, pero lo hacemos para ustedes, para dar a conocer el trabajo que se hace en el CISAN y el que se hace en otras instancias en relación a la misma temática. Bueno, pues bienvenidos todos. Carol, ¿tienes algo que decir?
Oh yeah, I have a lot to say. Well, thank you very much for welcome. First of all, I want to welcome Joel and Salewa. Is their, well, actually, some of their first time, Salewa's first time in Mexico and Joel's second time in Mexico. So I really thank you for coming here and attending the seminar and joining us at UNAM. I also want to thank Professor Dispain, Professor Waller, and Professor Ray, who are joining us via Zoom. And I want to thank CISAN and UNAM for allowing us to present to you a vision that the ultimate purpose of which is connecting the Global South with the Global North in this context where it looks like, we're entering in a phase of polycrisis, and we want to shed light on the importance of heterodox economics as a way of interpreting our contemporary reality. So thank you very much.
Bueno, pues queda oficialmente inaugurado nuestro seminario. Hacemos cambio de mesa y bienvenidos. Gracias, Juan Carlos.
Gracias.
Dr. Salewa Olawoye. I'm going to introduce her first, and then she will start her presentation titled The Dynamic Post-COVID World and the Structural Change in Canada. Professor Olawoye is an associate professor in the Business and Society program of the Department of Social Science at York University. She's the current director of the Harriet Tubman Institute for Research on Africa and its diasporas at York University, Canada. She has a PhD in Economics and Social Science Consortium from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Her research focuses on heterodox approaches to sustainable economic development through natural resources and monetary theory. She takes a bottom-up approach towards money from the individual level to the central bank. Her interdisciplinary research work mainly focuses on these issues in the sub-Saharan African region. She co-edited the book, Monetary Policy and Central Banking, New Directions in Post-Keynesian Theory, published in 2012, and has an edited book titled COVID-19 and the Response of Central Banks, Coping with Challenges in Sub-Saharan Africa, published in 2023. Please welcome Dr. Olawoye.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here, Carol. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everyone, for organizing this. I know that the workshop is on, POLYCRISES, U.S. and Mexico, but I'm going to bring in the other North American partner. And so I will be speaking on the post-COVID world that we have experienced in Canada in the last, 5 years, the things that we have done to make things different and tying that to where we could be going forward from that moment forward. So when we talk about, like we all know, when we talk about the global crisis that we've experienced, polycrisis isn't particularly new. It's happened a few times globally that people have experienced. For example, when the oil crisis hit in the 70s, there was also a war going on in the Middle East at the same time. Things were happening at the same time. And so us experiencing this from 2019, 2020 is just a different dimension to that. And so what we have experienced since COVID hit was multiple crises happening at the same time. So imagine yourself in the kitchen and you have something on the frying pan and fire is going out. And then at the same time, your microwave is having electrical issues. So many things happening at the same time. So it's putting out all that fire at the same time, so that you can at least have some kind of existence. And so we've had the biological crisis with COVID and other health issues. We've had environmental issues. Climate change has been an issue for years now, and having to battle it is always, we always keep seeing it. And then we've had the conflict, the Russian-Ukraine war that has been heightened since 2022. The issues that have happened since then, one of the things that I personally realized was how very connected the world is. Starting with COVID, something starts up in one location and then it spreads around the world. A war happens in one location and we all feel the impact. So it's almost, so saying something is not my business because it's not where I am isn't necessarily viable anymore. It's happening in one area, it's affecting every one of us. And so that interconnection that we have seen has been heightened by, different conduits of connectivity. It's back in the day when you had to write a letter, if you, let's say, for example, you went to school in another country, you had to write a letter that will probably take 3 months to get to your family. Now it's a quick email. It's, you don't have to go on a boat to get where you're going to. You can get there by plane really quickly. So all of that has brought the world even closer, which also means that the crises that we have, we get to share them really quickly too. And so because of that, so many other things have happened since. We've had issues of stagflation, we've had food shocks, shortages, we've had financial instability being heightened. It's not as if we weren't already experiencing all of these things, but now they're heightened at another level. And so looking at that, we're using that definition by Lawrence about a global polycrisis being a causal entanglement of crises in multiple global systems. So it's not only one area, it's fires everywhere, like the analogy of the kitchen that I used, and you're trying to put them all out. And so if we're going to look at the root of the polycrisis, we cannot remove the kind of capitalist structure that we have today. One of the things that I like to talk about in class is how very connected the world is through many things. For example, we could say that, well, COVID happened in one country because of, certain structures that were not put in place. But if we're to look at it, it kind of becomes the problem of the world because that one spot was producing for the rest of the world. It's everybody's problem if we push everything to just one spot and then so much is going on that health-wise, we all get to suffer for it. And so the kind of neoliberal capitalistic structure that we have today, where issues like inequalities exist that we haven't dealt with, and we would just say to ourselves, well, it's not my problem because it's this other person's problem, where we've had issues on exclusion, whether it's financial exclusion, the global financial crisis that started in the US 2007 due to, partly due to subprime mortgages. How did that happen? You had situations where people based on the colors of their skin were giving mortgages, or maybe their class level were giving mortgages at interest rates that were extremely high that they couldn't maintain it. Those kind of problems, we need to start looking at those things that we're ignoring, the inequalities that we choose to ignore would come back to bite us eventually. The exclusion that we choose to ignore will come back to affect us. At some point, the things that we say, oh, this is, I'm not from this class or this race or this, level, it's not so it's not my business, it eventually becomes our business because of the connection in the world. We've had situations and problems with stifled competition in the global supply chains, so much so that a war happened in and is happening in Russia and Ukraine, and that suddenly affects supply, and that affects inflation globally. At least it contributes to it globally. So it's a very connected world that we live in. And so now, if we now bring that into, let's say, for example, the Canadian perspective, all of those crises were felt, in addition to other local crises, housing crisis, for example, the housing market, the cost of living, increasing inequality, things like that. Those issues, issues with climate adaptation crisis were happening at the same time. But one of the things that I'm trying to, I want to show here today is, for example, production crisis, the production that had happened or that was affected due to COVID. So when COVID was announced, when it hit, and it was announced in March, let's see if I can point to it. Let's see, no, okay. So in March, when it had happened, we had a dip in our production level. And we experienced that dip for like, what's changed the language? Okay. We experienced that dip for like 2-3 months in our production levels. And eventually we started having, production going back to pre-COVID levels, even though it was still during COVID. And what were the things that we had put in place? What were the things that we did immediately that led to that rise? Looking at full-time employment as well, the same thing happened. The dip that had happened right during COVID, how did we get ourselves back to the, the levels that we were before COVID hit? One of the things that we did, and more of this will be spoken at the next session, but one of the things that we did was to increase the power of our state. When the crisis initially had hit, one of the first measures was stay-at-home order, and I feel like Canada went extreme with the stay-at-home order, especially in Ontario. We're home for like on and off for like 2 years. And the economy had to keep running at that time. Things had to keep happening at the time. So initially, the first thing that we did was the Canada Emergency Response benefit that was given directly to individuals. If we go back to the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008, one of the very early, one of the things that were given as a solution was benefits being accrued to the institutions that were termed too big to fail. And the problem with that was not many of it, trickle-down economics doesn't really trickle down. Not many of it trickled down. So now what Canada did in this situation was a direct to individuals emergency response benefit, usually based on your income level. Then there was also the emergency wage subsidy that was given directly to businesses and companies that couldn't afford to pay their workers because at the time, physical work was difficult. So we had to figure out ways to change that. Employment at accommodation, food services, and healthcare, social assistance industries. We had emergency support programs for businesses. And then at the same time, population was also being affected. And so we had to change our immigration rules to strengthen the weakened population growth. Then 3 other things that I really be expanding on was the use of remote work. And this really has become global. The increase in remote work, addressing inequalities such as race, gender, and then also environmentalism, going green on certain levels. So here, what I'm just trying to show is same thing, unemployment rates that we had experienced, even based on education level, based on education level, based on age. And we can see here how, during the COVID months in 2020, or rather the year that COVID really became a major issue, 2020, unemployment rates were very high. And so we had the structures that we had put in place to start to deal with it started to take effect from, let's say, 2021 and the years afterwards. So with remote work, what was discovered was like over a third of businesses had switched to remote work immediately. And we could say, well, it's not everyone who gets the education to work on computers, not everyone who, or the opportunity to work with computers. And so there were educational structures, people who had lost their jobs and had to retrain. So if you had to retrain using things, especially with computers, those were made available. So people had to go back at the government's expense to get retrained on this on how to work remotely. Businesses as well, we're talking about people, going back to working, remotely, teleworking. And since the pandemic ended, people still maintained that culture, sometimes half and half, sometimes fully, but people still maintained the remote working culture, so much so that, if anything happens, the economy still can run. It's not a complete, shutdown. Schools, I remember at the time, were trying to figure out how to get back to class. And I remember at the time, there were also provisions for, for students who didn't have access to computers, who were working, who would, who had prior to that time be relying on computers at school. And now that school is shut down, so there were provisions for them to pick up rental computers from school for the period so that they could work from home and learn from home. So that those opportunities were made. And so if we could ask ourselves, well, how were these paid for? I feel like Professor Ray is going to be speaking more about funding these state expenses. So that's why I'm going to leave that part. But we had these things in place. We had, like I said earlier, the Canada training benefits for those who didn't have any kind of skill that they could do remotely. Of course, people who worked in healthcare couldn't work, most of them couldn't work remotely. So there were some sectors that had to be in person, and that continued. Then addressing inequalities in employment. This has been an age-old issue. We've talked about, through the years, there's been many discussions on gender gaps in employment and even in pay. Employment rates among maybe like racial inequalities in employment. But one of the things that had happened when COVID hit at the same time, that's why I said it was putting multiple fires at the same time, was the Black Lives Matter movement that started in the U.S. around the same time. And so that kind of heightened the world. And then there was an Asian crisis as well that had started, that from an issue that started in the US as well. And so around the time, what it did was it just heightened people to the fact that people's knowledge or reality to the fact that there has been some racial inequality even in employment. And so people started having targeted racial hires. People started and it wasn't that every other person wasn't hired. It was just, let's level out the playing field. And so we saw employment rates in 2021 rising notably among minority groups in Canada. We saw the share of immigrants work also rising around the time, because the issue was, now we have to deal with these issues. Again, like I said earlier, if you think it's not your problem, wait till it circles back. And so we realized at the time that these are issues that we need to make priority and we need to deal with. Employment, even among Indigenous people in Canada, rose, not as well as we would have wanted to, but by then it was like 10% higher than the previous year. When it comes to gender as well, there were moves to close the gender gap and the gender pay gap. Even before COVID, those discussions were going on. And so during COVID, it became heightened, and these were things that people had to do. Even in the Canada-Mexico partnership, the agribusiness working unit section of it had identified, actions to benefit women and marginalized groups when it comes to employment. So while we still see men earning more than women in terms of wages and even the employment, we still see a gap, but that gap has been narrowed down. So from 16% in 2007 to like 12% by 2022. So it's a work in progress that has been going on in Canada. We also saw women-owned enterprises doubling since the possibility of exporting their products were increased, because those were things that were targeted. Those were things, plans that were put in place to close that gender gap. And so we saw more female entrepreneurs rising up and helping their businesses grow. And then finally, the other part that I wanted to touch on was going green, environmental and clean technology products. I usually joke that the US tells the world to about climate crisis, and then somehow Canada just takes it more seriously than everybody else. We started working on putting, making climate change, like putting climate change measures, like making that a priority. When COVID hit, the Prime Minister had talked about every unit prioritizing and pursuing a green future. Because then again, like I said, multiple crises, it heightened the other issues that we had ignored. And so we have seen the real GDP that was generated from the environmental and clean technology products sector increasing. It was increasing through the period, not as much as we would want to, but gradually increasing. So there is some progress there. There is some there's some green policies that have been put in place just specifically to ensure that we can tackle climate change at the same time. There's also been increase in employment in the environmental and clean technology product sector as well. So through the years, that has been made a priority. And then just to round up, I really wanted to put in one of the things that, I know that most of the relationship goes on between US and Mexico. And somehow if Canada has to work, we work through the US to Mexico. But there have been a high-level economic dialogue that has been going on. And one of the parts that I thought, even due to the structural change happening, was that happening even remotely as well. We're having this workshop as a hybrid situation where, now we understand that this is the way of the world, and so we can adjust. And we've also had like a bilateral cooperation through workforce development that I think will be better. For example, in looking at our production, when we had looked at the production slides, when I looked at the numbers with respect to agriculture, we had a dip and then it started to rise again, and that really was partly due to employment from Mexico for the agricultural sector. And then the bilateral change issuing like green policies that has been happening among the between the two countries. So for that partnership, if you have any questions. So thank you very much. And yeah, next one.
Thank you very much, Dr. Olawoye. We're going to be taking questions at the end of the session. It is time to introduce the second participant of this session, Professor Despain. Hans earned his PhD from the University of Utah with areas of specialization in macroeconomics, political economy, and history of economic thought. He taught at Nichols College for 20 years, where he chaired the economics program and honors program. He has been a visiting professor of economics at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. Currently, he is an economic faculty member at University of Massachusetts Amherst in USA, visiting professor of economics and finance at St. Joseph University in Macau, China, and also teaches at Boston University. Hans has published widely with a focus in macroeconomics, secular stagnation, monopoly capital theory, and political economy of education. He actively engages the popular press, newspapers, radio, and television. And Professor Dispain is joining us via Zoom. So please give him a warm applause.
Hello, everyone. I wish I was in Mexico City, but life happens, so I'm remote today. Carol, everybody can hear me? Can people hear me? Yes? Okay, very good. But it's my pleasure to be here and visit with everybody and exchange some ideas. It's my understanding that we're kind of thinking about the global situation and the economy south of the United States. Carol, if I'm correct, and I have some comments that I'd like to make regarding what we could discuss and think about. I'm very well aware. I have a lot of experts in a lot of areas here, and excited about that and that exchange. With respect to the first speaker and the multiple crises, I think that's really an important place to start. It's something I've been thinking about quite a bit, especially since about 2008, 2009, the financial crisis. Because it's not just that we have a social economic crisis, which I think is really important to think about. I got into economics to try to understand crises. So that's very, very interesting in and of itself. And I'll be very interested to hear what Professor Waller and Ray say, but I believe that we have been in a continuous type of crisis since 2008. It may even go back to 2001. And that I'm inspired to try to make that argument based on the insights that Karl Polanyi had in The Great Transformation, that the Great Depression in 1870s, 1880s was connected to World War I as a type of crisis, the Great Depression of the 1930s, and World War II. So we've got two economic crises, two political crises, and if you know your Karl Polanyi, as Professor Waller obviously does, and I'm sure several other people, that was manifest from money, from high finance, as Polanyi talked about. And as such, I think what is important when we start having these discussions, especially, as Carol said, I engage the popular media. Obviously, probably most of us engage young people. I think it's really important to make this accessible. And so we need to understand how capitalism, neoliberalism manifests in their own personal lives. Sometimes the social economics and the data is just not what they're interested in. So the multiple crisis idea is important because we know that in addition to the social economics, as was already mentioned, we have wars going on. And so, for example, I strongly believe, I've already said I think it's rooted in 201. I'm going to pause just 1 second. Carol, you will give me a thumbs up or something or a thumbs down when I need to be mindful of the time, please. Thank you. But the terrorist attacks happened in the United States, the planes that flew into the World Trade Centers for economic reasons. There is strong opposition to how the global economy has been operating or failing to operate. And I believe very strongly that there's been a lot of unequal exchange that has gone on not only between workplaces and employees, but also between the strong G7 economies, what Wallerstein calls the core economies, and the peripheral, right? Everybody else. And there is growing opposition, and I believe that's what the terrorist attacks were trying to bring attention to. You can read bin Laden and his statements to that fact. So more than, you know, here in the United States, we were told that they hate our freedom and they're trying to kill Americans. I don't believe that. I believe they were trying to bring, you know, an ignorant population of Americans aware that there's a lot of the world that is not benefiting from open markets because of unequal exchange. And I can talk more about that, but I won't. I want to jump to Putin and Ukraine, because I think when Putin invaded Ukraine, not only from the popular press do we know that he was upset with how close NATO was coming to the borders of Russia and the possibility of Ukraine becoming a member, but he also knew that there was a tremendous degree of disagreement within the G7 nations themselves. You can go and take a look at that. In other words, not only was the position of the neoliberal leadership in question because of the disarray within the G7 itself, there's an enormous question on whether or not U.S. should be the hegemonic power. And I think that, you know, I believe very strongly Putin is you can call him what you want, but I think it was a rational decision to challenge that power, and knowing that there probably wasn't much the U.S. in particular could do about it. I believe the same thing about Hamas. That has been a circumstance that has been going on for a very, very long time. You can go back to 1948. It's probably more accurate to say that the economic crisis has manifested in right around 1968. Most Gazans do not identify as Gazans. They identify as refugees. So that in and of itself is a type of crisis. I'm going to allow that might be independent of neoliberalism to some sort of degree. That is to say, it's between Palestinians and Israelis. But of course, the folks that live in Gaza, Hamas in particular, have wanted to challenge the hegemony of Israel and knew that the U.S. circumstance was compromised, again, economically. There is a big question on whether or not the U.S. hegemony is right. And you see that especially with the BRICS, right? Challenging the hegemony of the U.S. dollar. It will take a very, very long time to challenge that until it doesn't. These things can change very, very quickly. So what I'm trying to say here is not provide the argument of proving, in fact, but I am saying that the social economic crises that we're experiencing are very much connected to the political crises that we have seen globally. They are related. In addition, we know there's a lot of personal crises. It's not only the dispossession that has occurred, say, to Mexican citizens with the North American free trade agreement, but also here in the U.S. And even to a lesser extent in Canada, we have an opioid crisis. And Carol, what's the name of the book that you refer to? Deaths of Desire. Deaths of Desire. You know, had two Princeton economists that have very well documented that the abuse of drugs, the abuse of alcohol is very much correlated, and they make the argument caused by, not just a correlation, but caused by the economic crises and the economic precariousness of workers. So that's a personal crisis. So economic, political, personal. I also emphasize to young people the degree to which there has been a rise, especially in the United States, of mental health, a lack of mental health of young people, including an increase in not only the use of drugs, but suicide, and among other things, anxiety, depression, so on and so forth. So there's a personal crisis. We've already had to refer, you know, it's an environmental crisis. And then the fifth crisis that I want to emphasize is an existential. In fact, I would like to say, being mindful that some people may not have strong religious beliefs, but I think there's a spiritual crisis. And I'm not Catholic, but I'm very thankful for Pope Francis bringing that to the forefront. I think you can stay secular and just say capitalism creates a moral, existential, spiritual crisis. So that's the five-fold crisis. And if I have just a few minutes, I would like to say, you know, just a couple of things. And I think this will help. I hope I've set up a little bit to hand off to Professor Waller, but I would like to kind of set up a platform. Not that either one of them need that, by the way. I apologize for that, but for Professor Ray, because I think, you know, here's a big, long historical look at things. Let's understand a little bit of capitalism, because a very curious thing occurs. I studied the economics of a Cambridge economist named Morris Dobb, and he was highly influenced by Rosa Luxemburg, Russian economist. And he made some, studying the Indian economy in India, he made some provocative comments back in the 1940s and 1950s. No country has ever developed from capitalism unless they have started out imperialistic. That's a highly provocative challenge. So, you know, that will grow into dependency theory and social Wallerstein, I'm forgetting systems theory, whatever that theory is called. So there's some good theory that why countries don't grow. Now we understand imperialism. If you go in and you steal another country's resources and you enslave their people, you can understand why your economy may grow and theirs may not. They will experience degrowth. Okay. Well, at some point in time in the 19th century, human beings began to say, that ain't right. We shouldn't do that. And there was a concerted political effort to move away from that, which was a colonial phase. And that colonial phase said, okay, we're not going to steal your stuff, but we're going to put in place one of us in charge of you politically. So just think of apartheid in South Africa. It's probably the longest running colonial, aside from Israel and Gaza, by the way, which is still going on. But that colonial phase didn't steal the goods in the same way imperialism did, but it ended up having the same effect. And then we went through, how many minutes, Carol? I need
3 minutes.
Sorry?
3 minutes.
Oh, perfect. I need 3. So then we went through a neocolonial phase. The way the neocolonial phase worked was to say, okay, we're not going to put one of us in charge of you. We're going to put one of you in charge of you, but they're going to have been educated by us. So just think of the 1980s in Mexico, Madrid, Salinas, right? And nothing's wrong with being educated in the United States. I was educated in the United States. But they ideologically, spontaneously identified with the, with that colonial power. It was neocolonialism. It was a sovereign nation, so on and so forth. And each one of those phases we went through and said something's wrong. Let's fix it. Okay. I think those have been, and then that 4th phase we go into historically is globalism. And that globalism is to say, so this is the 1990s. This is the creation of the World Trade Organization and neoliberalism as we know it. And in that phase, I think, I want to argue there was a sincere effort that we don't want to see the G7s do well. We want to see everybody grow, all ships rise. I believe the globalists wanted that and intended that. What's phenomenal is that the result seems very imperialistic. It seems very colonial and neocolonial. The rich get richer and everybody else gets poor. And that's where you need, and this is my handoff to Randall, that's where you need to understand how financial markets work. And you need to understand the unequal balance of power between not just nations, because it's not, I don't think, just think about this. I'm on board with Trump's critique. I'm not a Trumpist, don't get me wrong there. But his critique of globalism is why he won the election, because he seems to understand how a lot of Americans are especially that we're in manufacturing, are suffering. But we need to understand how those financial systems work, because what we find, this will be my last comments here, what we find in the case of Mexico is there's a brand new study done by economists at MIT, make the argument that manufacturing and exports have done a tremendous benefit to the Mexican economy. As from a Marxist point of view, I don't deny that, but there's been a tremendous transfer of wealth in terms of labor hours. Okay, we don't need to talk about labor hours, but productivity has gone up, wages have gone up, but not as fast. Does everybody understand? So where does that wealth go? That wealth goes to the American corporation, Ford or whomever, and then gets transferred back in terms of dollars. You have a population in Mexico that gets some sort of benefit, but the comparative benefit is the Western corporations. You don't even have to pick on Americans. And so it's a relative empowerment of Western corporations. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hans. I appreciate it. The name of the book is Death of Despair. Death of Despair. All right. Well, our time is to welcome Professor Waller. Professor William Waller is the William R. Keenan Jr. Professor of Economics. He's an expert on institutional economics and the ways in which the economy intersects with public policy. Currently, he's the chair of the economics department and director of wine studies at Hobart and William Smith College. Waller also serves as the editor of the Journal of Economic Issues, a scholarly publication focused on institutional economics that is produced by the Association for Evolutionary Economics. A long-standing member of AFI, Waller has served as president, vice president, and secretary-treasurer. He has also served as the GEI editorial board, the author of dozens of articles and book chapters. Waller has co-edited several books, most recently Cultural Economics and Theory, The Evolutionary Economics of David Hamilton. And I think he's joining us now from London. So please give him a warm of applause.
Thank you. And thanks to Delta Airlines, I've been home about 20 minutes now. I appreciate being invited to this. I have had the good fortune in my life to always live near one of the United States borders, allowing for frequent escape. I think I want to talk about the polycrisis that we face today in the institutional context of pathological neoliberalism. We could go back to the 1970s, but I think the mid 2008's bad enough. When we think of Mexico and U.S. bilateral relationships, from an institutionalist perspective, I want to talk bilateral problems. And of course, there are some that are inescapable. The environmental considerations are shared by the United States and Mexico and are intensified in the U.S. Southwest by conflicts and water needs. I think that there is a nexus of employment inequality and migration issues that are incredibly important to the health of both countries. I think there's a crisis of care in both countries. I think the place I want to start is with the impact of neoliberalism on the American consciousness. All crises are USA crises to US citizens. They can live on the border and they can't see it. Everything in American politics is internalized to the United States, and everyone outside the United States does not figure into most Americans' political calculations. And this has resulted in that wonderful combination of populism, jingoism, and racism, which dominates American politics at this time. Indeed, American politics is completely non-functional, and that's a very bad thing in a polycrisis. In terms of employment, in many ways, the employment situation post-COVID is actually quite good in the United States, except for the workers who left the labor force and no longer counted as unemployed. Our labor markets are responsive to migration and immigration. And in fact, in the United States, many of our industries are utterly dependent on it. And yet the US public ignores this reality and wants to deport visiting workers in the United States who are essential to all of the US economy, especially in the agricultural sector. At the same time, the lunatics among us would also like to push all the women out of the labor force and all the children under the age of 18 in the labor force, which would mean that the US labor force would be reduced by about 72%, which would be a whole new crisis. But migration policy in particular cannot be addressed unilaterally, despite the US myopia. And as a consequence, particularly the populist policies promoted by he who shall not be named, make even the conversation of how migration policy should be handled. Obviously, immigration between the United States and Mexico is something that has to be negotiated between the United States and Mexico. And it is a real problem in that a country that does not know who's coming in or going out or have any influence over that it loses a degree of sovereignty. And both countries have a need to regularize and manage a reasonable migration policy because of the intertwinedness. Of course, this is tied to inequality in the United States, which is increasing at an incredible rate. And that's when we ignore the increasing inequality of migrant workers in the United States as well. Inequality creates instability, it creates political chaos, and is it in the United States, it is at its worst in a very long time, and inequality in Mexico is extreme as well. The environmental, the employment inequality, and migration crises also lead to the crises of care. I believe that the purpose of an economy is not so much to make stuff, but to provide for flourishing of all human beings and their many differences. And in both countries, there is food insecurity, which is utterly ridiculous given the food production capacities and reality of the United States. Indeed, absent price supports, the price of agricultural products in the United States would probably very rapidly approach zero, which is why there are price supports. We produce a huge amount of food and use it in very wasteful ways. And there are a huge number of people in the United States and Mexico who experience food insecurity. There is health insecurity. Both countries are unable to provide health or unwilling to provide necessary health care for their populations. In one case, it's the actual resources available. In the United States, the case is the grotesque misallocation of resources with regard to medical and health care in the United States. There is a failure of education policy, which means the neglect of the future of our children combined with the impact of our neglect of the environment on the impacts of our children. Sadly, as I watch the political season unfold in the United States right now, there seems a total lack of generosity of spirit with regard to our relationship with Mexico. We tend just to ignore Canada whenever possible because it feels like an adjunct, though the environmental crisis is likely to exacerbate that because the Great Lakes control about 1/3 of the world's fresh water supply, and that is regulated by a Canada with treaty which says no water can leave the Great Lakes watershed. As the American Southwest and regions outside that watershed become more desperate for water, that should lead to an internal conflict over water that'll be very similar to the conflicts along the southern border. Populism has a place because speaking to the popular need and the popular will is very compelling. But in a neoliberal context, the view of the popular will is based on individual well-being determined by the individual. There is no notion of the social. And as a consequence, when we look at the world, as Hans suggested, from a Polanyian perspective, that blunts the protective response because that is based on popular organization and rejection of policies which create these problems. We are divided in the United States, but we are also divided from Mexico by racist and regionalist barriers that are exacerbated, indeed encouraged under the neoliberal regime. So the polycrises that we see before us, to me, are one big interrelated crises. And they are crises in the deformation of institutions in the United States and the lack of interaction with institutions in the United States with comparable and related institutions in Mexico. I wish I could say I was more optimistic than I am. In recent weeks, it looks like the re-election of Donald, you know who, is no longer inevitable. But when one looks at the alternative, the problems I have outlined today will not be on their political agenda in the way necessary to resolve any aspects of this polycrisis. I don't know how we address the kind of myopia and regionalism and lack of simple human decency and concern for others that dominates American culture, except in a tribalist way. And I do not know and will not claim to know how the people in Mexico view the United States and its citizens, except I cannot imagine that it is particularly optimistic or warm. So I think moving forward, we have very little to look for in terms of national policy or realistic outreach on the part of either government in an effective way, and that will certainly be primarily a function of United States myopic inability to see that the United States and Mexico are inextricably linked. And so that we must look to smaller interventions where connections can be made across the border on particular issues where some benefit could accrue to both societies, possibly coordination of some healthcare aspects, educational aspects. At least a humanizing of U.S. migration policy from what we experienced from 2016 to 2020, some realization that our economies are inextricably already interlinked in a way in which they cannot be divided or separated. Hopefully we will make it past November and be able to look to possibly an alteration in the political rhetoric in the United States. But quite frankly, I think that if that is not the case, the polycrisis will persist and become worse in the deterioration of institutions associated with environmental conservation and environmental reversal. Employment inequality and migration and care will continue to worsen. And I'd like to conclude on that happy note.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Weller. We appreciate pessimism because that is the way to really approach our reality from a more truthful context. Well, it is our time to welcome our speaker, Joelle. Allow me to introduce her, and then she will proceed with her presentation. Professor Leclerc is chair and professor of economics and finance at the State University of New York, Buffalo State. Her research studies the link between the financial sector and the real economy. She works with undergraduate and graduate students in the United States, Canada, and France, and the United Kingdom working on this topic. She acts as a dissertation reviewer for PhD students at the University of Paris Sorbonne, where she gives seminars and works with the PhD students. Her latest publication is a book chapter entitled Government Debt in the Modern Money System, published yesterday in the Elgar Companion to Modern Monetary Theory. So congratulations, Professor Leclerc. Please proceed.
So thank you to everybody at CSUN. It's just wonderful to be here and to be in the presence of my past colleagues and current colleagues here in Mexico and in the US and in Canada. So just a super pleasure to be here. So thank you so much. My presentation is going to be a little bit more technical, more, I'm going to bring up some data about the US economy, where we're at right now, and where I see us maybe moving in the near future. And we can take that and kind of extrapolate where we can view ourselves in the near future in terms of, do I see a crisis brewing in the United States economic situation? Or, okay, thanks. Or are we in a kind of safe situation? So let's see. So I'm going to start by talking about the economic side of the economy, and then I'm going to look at the financial side, and then I'm bringing those two together in my conclusion. So from the economics perspective, I'm going to look at GDP growth. Has GDP been growing in the United States in a stable way or not? Then I'm going to look at unemployment levels, inflation, and then talk a little bit about the interest rate. Then I'm going to look at the financial side of the economy. I'm going to present the financial sector balances that have been updated to the last data available. So those will be the latest data that you can find right now. And then I'm going to look at the different sectors. So I'm going to look at private sector, which is households and businesses, and see what's happening at the level of businesses and the level of government and how everybody is working together in those sectors from the financial perspective. So by looking at both of the sides of the economy, the productive economic side and the financial side, we can see whether the financial side poses risks to the financial stability or the economic side poses risks to the financial stability. So how the two might be interlinked together. And that's, a major interest of mine to look at how those two work together. Because we know that changes in the financial system, they have a very serious impact on the real productive side of the economy. And here I'm kind of looking at what's happening in the real side and what's looking at the financial side and what we can see in the US economy. So, I mean, you would want to do this for the Mexican economy, but I didn't have enough time. Maybe next time, or maybe I'll be invited to come back and do that for you. So I looked at the real GDP growth, and it looks like real GDP growth is pretty stable. If you look at this graph, we do see a massive decrease during 2020 and then increase in economic growth as a result of, stimulus and return to work and everything else. But if you look at the latest data available here, you can see that in our last quarter that's available, which is 2024 first quarter, our GDP is growing, and it's growing at a rate of 3%, which is pretty stable and in line with all the data here come from 2022 or 2002 to the present day. So we're kind of looking at this modern period. So you can see in terms of GDP growth, we see that GDP growth is stable at about 3%, and we're growing, at a rate of 3% relative to the preceding first quarter of 2023. So we're in stable ground in terms of GDP growing. Let's look at how unemployment's doing. So if you look at, this is the unemployment data again from 2002. All my data are going from 2002 to the most current data available. So here we're looking at data which is only offered on a monthly basis. So you can see that unemployment is actually rising toward the end there. So if you look, our unemployment rate is rising. That's a negative for the economy. That means the economy is not growing even though it's growing at a rate of 3%. It's not growing fast enough to make enough jobs for people to, have a benefit in that growing GDP. So the unemployment rate is increasing. It's now 4.3%, which is above average. The population is increasing as well. So we see an increase in the labor force. This data isn't shown here, but I was just expressing it. The not in the labor force is also up. So the number of people employed is increasing, but the number of people unemployed is also growing, but at a faster rate. So we need to create jobs at a faster rate in order to keep that unemployment stable or have it decline. So we can see that although the economy is growing, it's not growing fast enough to create the jobs that are needed in order to keep everyone, employed. Let's look at inflation. So inflation's been a big thing, obviously, since 2020. We are really concerned about inflation, but you'll notice that the latest data available here show that inflation is very stable now. So we'll see that inflation has been stable at about 3%. This is a huge difference, and it's in line with all the previous data except during that COVID period. So we're looking at a very stable looking economy right now. Overall inflation is low and even falling. There's no pressure. There's not that much pressure on prices at the moment, at least for the overall price level. That might not be true for energy prices, right? We can look at different prices that are targeted. Like Waller, he brought up the idea of food price inflation. That's definitely a case, but we also have inflation in energy prices due to the war in Ukraine, and the targets in Gaza, also the issues that are happening there. So, but in general, for overall price level, it's pretty stable, growing at 3%. So what about the Fed funds rate? So, in the US, the government has been using the federal funds rate, which is the base interest rate for the entire economy, and sets the interest rates for the rest of the yield curve. You can see that the interest rate right now is pretty stable and has remained stable at 5.25% to 5.75%, or 5.25% and 5.5%. And that has been stable for since last August. Because inflation has been pretty stable, there's a lot of talk. The Federal Open Market Committee, which is the committee that is responsible for establishing the Fed funds target, they are talking that at their mid-September meeting, they're probably going to lower that interest rate. So that interest rate has been used as mainly the main instrument in order to target inflation, rather than looking at price, just targeting energy prices, targeting prices of food. Instead of targeting only the areas where prices were inflating, they said, okay, we're just going to, target all the prices together by increasing the interest rate. And so that's what they did. And it seems to have worked overall. And obviously that has negative impacts in certain sectors, more negative than others. But you can see that overall inflation, if we're looking at it from a very, generalized macroeconomic perspective, has been going down. It's increasing at 3%, right? Which is a normal rate of inflation. So we don't have any concerns from that perspective. So looking at it from GDP, unemployment rate, inflation, the major macroeconomic issues that we're concerned with, we can see that the economy looks pretty stable from that perspective, okay? It looks like it's growing at a rate of 3%. Interest rates probably going to go down. That is what's going to be interesting to see. What will be the influence on the rest of the different sectors of the economy, on the productive sector and the financial sector, of a potential reduction in the interest rate in September? And that's coming right before the election. So let us see. I am very interested in seeing what's going to happen in the economy at that time. Let's look at the financial side of the economy, which is really, influenced obviously deeply by interest rate fluctuations. So if we look at the financial sector, I'm using a financial sector balances model, which many of you are probably familiar with. So I looked at the financial sector balances model from 2002 to 2024, which is the latest data I could get. The blue line represents the private sector. So that's all households and businesses in the US, their financial balance. So whether their net saving is greater, their net investment is greater, savings minus investment. So it looks like generally they're in a positive stance. So you can see that that blue line is above the zero line. That means they have positive balances, they have positive savings. US households and US businesses are in the positive section, in the positive region. But you notice that in the very last part there, since 2023, it's reducing. It's still positive, right? But that's going down. So they're still in the positive net saving position, but that net saving is being reduced. Now, the opposite, or kind of the mirror of that, is what's happening at the government level. So you can see that, and that's the green line, the Chartreuse line on the bottom. That line is representing a government deficit. So you can see that in general, the government has had a deficit or not in general, it has always had a deficit for this entire period. And during the COVID period, that deficit went down quite a bit. So they increased the deficit during COVID period, and now it has been reduced pretty significantly. And those deficits end up as positive balances for the private sector. That's why you see that mirror image, right? So whenever the government spends money, that goes into the hands of a household, it goes into the hands of a business, right? So that's why it's a mirror image. Government goes into debt, private sector goes into surplus, okay? So that's how it works. Now you can see that at the end of the period, just as the private sector their balances are declining, the government deficit is increasing or is reduced, okay? So this means that government is not spending as much in the economy, and the balances of the private sector are reducing as a result of that, or at the same time. So this model doesn't tell you, is it the government that's doing it, or is it because of the government, or is it because of investment by firms or households? So that's why it's kind of tricky about this model, right? Is it tells you what is going on with the data, but it doesn't tell you causation, right? Is it because the government reduced its deficits that businesses are not spending as much? Or is it because businesses aren't spending that much that the government deficit has been reduced? So we don't know. And that's something, you can study, you can posit, but at least now we have the data. So since 2022 to 2023, private sector saving and foreign sector savings were increasing. Foreign sector is all the other countries that trade with the US. These were all offset in government deficits. So we see government deficits were up and foreign savings sector and private sector savings were up. That's until 2023 third quarter. So for 2023 third quarter to the current time, our private sector savings and foreign sector savings fell. This is offset by government deficits falling as well, okay? So we don't know which one is the chicken and which one is the egg, right? We don't know what comes first and what leads the other. So we have to think about what theory we're going to be using to explain that. So, most of the private sector saving decline came from lower business saving. So, we can talk about why that is happening, why that is expressed like that in the data. And it's possible that these changes have contributed or are contributing to the current instability that we're seeing lately in the United States. So we're starting to see the beginnings of potential economic and financial instability in the United States right now. And I believe that may be related to some of these changes that we're seeing that have been happening in the last year at the financial side, but also in the employment side. So if we break down, I want to see what's happening for private sector. So I break down the private sector into the households and the businesses. So the blue line represents all the households and the red line represents all the businesses. So you notice that all the businesses are all in surplus and all the households are all in surplus, and that surplus has been going down and kind of stable toward the end of the period, toward our present day. Now, if you look at businesses, they're usually hovering right around the zero mark. They've been since 2002 positive, but there have been a couple dips there. And here again, toward the end of the period, you see that business sector surpluses are going down. So the business sector is spending more in the economy than it is getting back in terms of, receipts. So here we have to think about what is happening in the economy. What's the leading factor? So as a Keynesian economist, so I'm a Keynesian economist, so I believe that investment is the driving factor. That is what gets the economy going. That's what moves the economy. And that's in line with, a general theory reading of Keynes, okay? So businesses regained a positive balance in 2023. That's falling right now. Households have maintained positive balances, but these have declined dramatically since 2021. So since 2023, the last quarter, household balances are also declining. Since 2023, overall, we have reduced savings by U.S. households and businesses, and these are reflected in lower government deficits. Again, this could be a factor in the economic instability and potential upcoming recession or financial instability that we're seeing. So I'm saying from the way that I'm expressing this, I could have expressed it differently, but I decided I actually changed it at the last minute because I wanted just to be consistent with this Keynesian idea that it is investment, not government, that leads the economy. So businesses decided to spend less in the economy or spend more in the economy. Maybe they didn't get receipts that they were expecting. Government deficits fell as a result, offsetting that, okay? We don't know that government deficits might not increase as employment, is decreasing right now. Let's see what's going to happen. So there's some interaction there that I'm interested in learning more about. So just kind of bringing everything together, GDP growth has been stable at 3%. Unemployment is rising slightly at 4.3%. Inflation is stable at 3%. The interest rate, which is currently between 5.25% and 5.5%, is likely to be reduced. On the financial side of the economy, the government deficits are falling. On the private sector side, households and business balances are falling. So how do I bring this all together kind of as a, quick and dirty way of looking at it? It looks like increased government deficits or business investment that create, and it has to be the kind of investment that creates jobs, could reduce the unemployment rate and help stabilize economic growth and financial stability. So there's that relationship between jobs are being created, or there's investment happening, but it isn't creating jobs enough to keep up that everyone has a share in economic growth. And that is potentially leading to more economic and financial instability. Okay. So that's basically what I had prepared for today. I hope that it's, helpful. I know everyone else had, really integrated a lot of information about, what is happening with the Mexican economy, but I was kind of relying on the Mexicans to present that perspective. And then maybe we could have a conversation about that, the relationship between, the well-being of the US economy and the well-being of the Mexican economy as a result of that. So, I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you to everyone, and great. Nice to be here.
Well, thank you very much, Joel, for this the raw data that tell us the story, and for the other presenters to provide their perspectives about the polycrisis. And perhaps we can start with the macroeconomic base and build up from there to understand a little bit of the social, political, environmental, and water crisis that we have discussed in this panel. So let's start with a round of questions. We have plenty of time. It's 11:28. It's scheduled until 12. So we have approximately, we'll say 25 minutes. So perhaps I first collect the questions, and then presenters can, please, if you are asking a question, mention the name of the presenter, your question. And so the presenter can write down the question, and then at the end we open the floor for the answers. All right? Yes. Hansi Spain, yes.
If you can see the origins of all these polycrises in the financiarization, I mean, is financiarization and behavior of financial markets responsible for unemployment, for the lack of investment, for the lack of efficiency of the traditional tools of economic policy and monetary policy. The other one is for Joel Leclerc. It's more or less in the same sense. I mean, how do you link this these results you present with the way monetary policy is directed, especially in financial markets? No, I don't know how now efficient, how can be such efficiency. O sea, ¿qué tan eficaz puede ser la política monetaria, más la política fiscal, dada la manera en cómo se comportan los mercados? Thank you. Those are my questions.
Yes, I was like, Claudia, just ask Joel why? Why they are not, what's the idea? Why they are not, the people are not buying houses? Why? Is it the interest rate of the mortgage? Is everybody waiting that decrease the interest? Or there's a real problem in this economic structure? What is the reason? Because everybody wants a house, but nobody wants to buy it, and the sellers also wants to renegotiate, and the mortgage is 6. I think they reduced just a little bit, the mortgage reduced just during these days, but it was nothing. So what's going on? Because I think the housing is very important. It's a sector that we must improve our studies, because that was one part of the crisis, of the great financial crisis. And also right now, for example, this, I don't know if it is related to the Chinese economy, because they are also having a building problem. So, but why? I want to know why Americans are not buying houses right now.
Maybe Salewa also can answer that question from a perspective of Canada.
Okay, sorry.
All right, thank you very much. Any more questions? Anybody else from online? Any questions from our online visitors, participants? Oh, we have one here, please.
Well, more than these economic models, how can I put together different variables to understand these polycrises in any context or phenomena to explain something? In my case, I'm thinking in migration variable with a specific industrial variable. If I want to connect this to crisis, how can I do it in terms of methodological?
I think that's a very, very good question, and perhaps we can leave it for everybody who wants to answer in the panel. Everyone will have something to say. Thank you very much. Anybody else? Another question? Yes, Hans?
Yeah, may I, Carol, if I may?
Absolutely.
Joelle, I don't know how to ask this question, so I'm going to do my best. But so let me put it this way: when you talk about stable growth and low unemployment, I don't dispute that data. By the way, I don't. I think that's correct. But if we start looking at it distributionally, as William was pointing out with respect to, flourishing, right? It's not just growth. We need people flourishing. I see a lot of that growth not being distributed in such a way that is shared throughout the economy, and the employment situation, although we're historically extremely low, the precariousness is very high. I'm wondering if you agree with that.
Thank you, Hans. Anybody else? Questions? I think we have a well set. Anybody who would like to go first?
So I'm going to start with the question about everyone wanting to buy houses, but no one buying houses. So using Canada, for example, the effect of the polycrisis that had happened, including our own local crisis, had led to skyrocketing inflation rates. And unfortunately, the inflation was caused by multiple causes. So it was not just demand side, it was supply side as well. But unfortunately, our very conservative Bank of Canada economists only know one way of dealing with inflation, like almost every central banker out there, which is increasing interest rates and forcing a recession. And so what that has meant is that the cost of borrowing for mortgages is also very high, and people haven't been able to afford them, which technically is what they were trying to drive at. In addition to the fact that we do not have enough supply of houses for the growing population that we have, but the interest rates on their own have been a very have been a strong deterrent towards home ownership, even rentals in Canada. So housing in general has been affected by high rates of interest rates. The central bank only started reducing it 2 months ago, I believe. And the reductions aren't at the same pace as the increments happened. So while we were having 0.5% increases like almost every month happening 2020, 2022, 2023, now we're only experiencing like 0.25 at intervals. And so it still hasn't gotten to a level where people can afford to get houses. And this is in addition to other policies that honestly were set to deal with the housing crisis that we had, because prior to that, even on closing on a house, the closed system that we had to be reopened so that people aren't bidding more than the houses are actually worth, because that's what has led to had contributed to the fact that people couldn't get houses. But again, interest rates are the reason why we have people who want houses but can't afford them. Regarding putting the variables to understand the polycrisis, that would be, I would say, start with what are the things that are affecting the individual country in the first place. So I'm usually one to say one size would never fit all. So while the problems that we have had with housing and employment, and which has led to a lot of debates on immigration in Canada as well. While we've had those issues, and as a result, those variables have become very important. For the longest time, the variables that were largely ignored were racial issues and gender partially, other kind of inequality issues weren't as heightened till everyone had to sit with themselves at home during COVID and realize we're messed up. And so now we have to start dealing with this. So individual country issues would spur the variables that you want to start looking at. The sector issues as well, that, based on the sector in that economy, this is what is affecting us. So while we have our issues in Canada are very different, and so as a result, the variables that we're looking at are very different. I feel like we only started really dealing with immigration issues recently in the last 2 years, where we've had the debates that, those very unsavory debates that come out of the US normally when it comes to immigration talks. We started having those. And so that's what I'm saying. Each country has its own issues. And so that would spur the variables that you want to look into. But in the economy as a whole, you generally look at unemployment rates, you look at inflation, you want to see what's happening with inflation, you want to see what's happening with the production levels, you want to see what's happening with government spending. You want to see what's happening with businesses as well, business spending. So you're looking at that. You want to see what's happening in the private homes. So you want to see what's happening with households as well. And then you're looking at relationships with the rest of the world. But I usually would prefer to start internal before you start to open up externally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaliwa, for taking care of those questions. I am going to steal a few of those things in my answers too. So I'm going to begin, and I'm just going to go by order that I got the questions. So I'm going to start with Claudia. Claudia asked the question of, is monetary policy, how much do I believe that monetary policy is actually effective in remediating some of the issues that we're finding with the problems with financialization and also with the unemployment issues? Like, is the reduction in the interest rate that we're anticipating in September, is that actually going to have the effect that we would like on the economy? Is it going to help boost unemployment or boost employment? Which is kind of what I insinuated in my talk. So I appreciate that you didn't say it in a mean way, but you're absolutely right. You know, as Keynesians, we don't believe that that a reduction of the interest rate is necessarily going to have a positive effect. And we know that it's not necessarily going to have a positive effect on employment. We need to have an industrial policy, like we can say fiscal policy, but we say industrial policy that directs any new investment towards job creation. Otherwise, you can have a lower interest rate, you can have a lot of investment, but it just goes and doesn't create jobs. So I think that that's a very good critique of my presentation, and I appreciate it, and I'm taking it to heart, because, you know, we do need to think about, hey, maybe the central bank wants the something good for our economy, but maybe they don't realize that unless there's an additional industrial policy targeting any new investment toward job creating activities, that even a reduction of the interest rate will not necessarily reduce the unemployment rate. Okay, so that's a very good point. So we would have to try to think about how we can direct maybe banks to say, loans that are made for new investment by businesses would have to be directed towards certain number of jobs have to be created. So that would be one way to do it. And that's kind of inspired by the people here at UNAM who have really looked at that issue a lot in the past, including Alicia, who's here with us today. So I hope that that answers or responds to what you were saying, your critique. Alicia, she mentioned that why are people not buying homes? Is it due to the interest rates? What's the reason? In the US, people are not buying homes. It's true also in Canada. And I think Shaniwa brought up a couple issues that are very, very relevant. And I'm going to piggyback partly on those issues. So I'm going to begin by saying, yes, the interest rate is too high. So it makes home ownership really difficult for people. And the other part of that is that employment is not generated at salaries that are high enough so that people can afford to purchase homes. So, you know, back in our parents' day, at least that's what I hear, it was easier for somebody that just got their first job with their salary to afford a house. But our salaries, when we first start, are new people that are just entering the labor force and have professional salaries that normally should be able to buy a house, can't do that. Even with the lower, even if we were to lower the interest rate, they can't do it because their salaries are not at the level relative to what our parents had. So there's that issue there. Why are salaries so low relative to what they were back in the day of our parents? And why, you know, what can make home ownership more possible, because that's part of our vision for like a good life, you know? So if we want to make that, we are going to have to create policies that make it possible for people to buy homes, or that salaries for middle income people to grow. So I'm sure that's related to this delinking of productivity and economic growth, you know, that in wages, that we've seen since late 1980s or late 1970s, 1978. Another part of the problem there, so I think that's probably a dominant part that economists we can be concerned with, trying to motivate government policy that makes it more likely for jobs to be earning salaries that could purchase current homes, or put limitations on home prices in some way so that more people have access. Now, the other part of that is that was brought up by Shariwa, and I am very happy to hear that, you know, to be reminded of it, is that the supply of homes is not increasing either. So since COVID, interest rates went up, but that made the construction of homes really not profitable either. So building materials prices have gone up, interest rates have gone up for construction loans. And so material prices have gone up, loans in order to get those materials and engage the workforce have also been more expensive. So that has prevented the supply of new homes, the construction of new homes, reducing the supply and creating this increase in the price of homes that are already on the market right now. That might be also true in the Chinese economy. I'm not studying the Chinese economy too closely right now, but there's definitely going to be an impact of those supply price increases and having an effect on the Chinese ability to construct new homes, increasing supply, but also that I think they had a glut. They had a lot of housing. So over there, maybe the issue is the interest rate is too high and that salaries are not high enough to warrant the ability, like give the people the ability to buy a home. So I would say that that's probably the way I would look at that question, and I hope that it addresses. And if not, you can pose a supplementary question. Is that good enough, Alicia, or no? Does that answer you? Okay, okay. Oh, Bill. Sure, go for it. Bill, did you want to add something to that or?
Yes, I want to emphasize the notion that houses are not being built. And the fact that you can't look at houses nationally and really get an understanding of what the housing market is like. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can't buy a house. Because anything that isn't already owned is being purchased and rented out on a daily basis in terms of Airbnbs. So the rental market in Washington, D.C. is all short-term. And the people who would rent a house while saving to purchase a house no longer can reasonably expect to do that. The average house in Capitol Hill starts at $1.5 million. I live in upstate New York like you do, but I live in the Lake area. Home prices quadrupled during the pandemic. And in the city, the same thing has happened. All the properties, rental properties, have been purchased and are being rented out on a day-by-day basis, which puts our students in a difficult situation, but also working people in the community who would come here for a new job, rent a house in the hopes of purchasing. So sometimes the local problems create a different set of barriers than the kind of aggregate stuff shows us. The same thing happens with regard to work and income and distribution. Sure, any job's better than no job, but does the United States really want to increase the financial sector so that it's 40% of employment? I mean, what good would that do anybody? In fact, probably reducing it to 5%. And having everybody work 10 hours a week for the same salary would do a great deal more for the U.S. economy, distributionally and in terms of the quality of life. There are other things that again, the aggregates don't show. Jolie mentioned, great, the Fed lowers interest rates, and then are businesses going to look around at the slightly declining situation you just indicated and be all hepped up to invest? Why? Would this be the time when you would take on investment in the economy? Interest rates, everything else being equal, might increase investment. But as I seem to recall, firms still invest with the prospect of a profit involved, not just because the money's cheap. And so consequently, given the direction the economy is already tending, the interest rate decline, should it come, may be about 3 months too late to really do us any good, and maybe even less good than that. So the local conditions and the economy that things are being put into are important, but they always occur in local economies and in local situations, which give rise to huge disparities across two rather large countries. And then, there's the notion of interconnection that, there is no difference between Mexico and the United States agricultural systems. They're one system. And the policy in one area cannot ignore the other. And there's no likelihood that the United States is going to alter its agricultural policy in such a way as to make the distribution of food, the money wasted on transporting food all over the place, and the turning of corn into ethanol, because it might make sense in terms of food security across in the entire North America. So I'm not pessimistic. I'm near despair.
Hans has a question. Yes.
Yeah, Hans, go ahead.
Yeah,
I can see your
actually,
hand.
it's a comment. It's a comment, but what I want to echo. Say Liwi. Am I saying that correct? I hope.
Shalewa.
So
Shalewa.
Liwa. Thank you. Thank you. And also just put some numbers because I did this for New England with respect to home prices. So home prices generally, I'm making up, just or rounding off to make it a general comment. Home prices went up about 50% since 2019, and so you're talking about an increase from $250,000 to almost $400,000 for the same home in a very short period of time. When you put the interest rates on, that home in 30 years, when it was $250,000, would have cost you about $575,000, $575,000, $500,000 US. That same home today, with the 50% increase in price, with where the interest rates are in 2024, is $1.2 million in a 30-year mortgage in your payments. So it has more than doubled. So a young person today, as Bill was just saying, has to pay significant more. And I totally agree. You got to look at individual markets. It's, but generally speaking, a young person today has to buy 2 homes to the one that I bought. That's not even being fair because the prices have gone up significantly since I bought my first primary home. But I hope everybody understands that point. And then I would just say also this, Joelle, I consider myself a Keynesian, but unambiguously I come from the Cambridge post-Keynesian tradition. And so I want to question, why the hell do we have interest rate on some goods? Whether it be homes, and you did mention this, with access. But, when you start talking about things like you have interest rate to go to college, to start your life, you've got to go into debt to somebody. We've got to, it's way beyond just greater access. There needs to be a fundamental transformation, in my opinion. Otherwise, there's strong relationship, interest rates decrease, investments important, all that I would agree with. Joelle, I'll just say this. I miss Fred Lee very much.
Me too. Well, thank you for bringing those things up. I think, we definitely need to look at this from a multidimensional perspective, and that's why all of us are here. I mean, we're all coming at it from our own individual perspective, and everyone has something that they can add to it. I'm just adding that kind of very straightforward perspective, but I'm just got more interested in doing that than doing more of the geopolitical stuff, but that's why we have more than one participant in seminars like that. I want to finish answering the other questions that were posed really quickly. So the student or professor that brought the question about methodology, how do I connect the economic or financial crisis to the data or to the industry so that I can understand it better when you're studying it? I think it's every time you're just going to have to decide for yourself, look at that particular issue and see what data might be relevant for you. Looking at data, it's a lot of work, and you're going to see also what is available for you to use as a proxy to measure certain issues. We're going to talk about those issues a little bit later. I think that Carol and I just think your question is excellent, and we want to look at it in more detail, but we can also work with you individually if you have a particular thing or research topic that you're working on right now. Because I know a lot of my PhD and undergraduate students, they're always coming to me with this kind of question. So let's look at it more specifically so that we can target exactly what you need in the data and what's available in the data. Because sometimes you want something and it's not available, so you have to try to make something else work. And then Hans, you brought up the idea of distribution and how to flourish, how to create an economy that flourishes, and the precariousness of employment, even if unemployment goes down. The kind of jobs that are being created right now are very precarious, meaning, they don't last long durations of time. Like this job as professors that we have lasts our whole life, but we're very lucky and very isolated in the economy. I see many of my friends in the private sector, they're just hopping from one job to the next, like 3 years in one job or 5 years, then another 3 or 5 years, and they're hopping all over the place. And those are people with, you know, high level degrees, and those are like the great jobs, you know, that are available out there. So I don't know. I think that we have to think as a community, right? Those are social policies that we need to start thinking about, social economic policies that we need to kind of get our government to be working on, to think about what kind of jobs are we going to permit to be created by industries, and how much, you know, I do think that people want to have longer lasting jobs. They don't appreciate the precariousness of this kind of economy. But it is, you know, a feature of capitalism unrestrained. And maybe we can bring it back to those golden years, or some semblance of that, a new way of looking at it, where we have more stability in our jobs for the longer term. So I hope that I addressed most of the issues. I think that was a really good session. Moving back to you.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate your attention, your comments, your questions. This is the preliminary stages of what seems to be an effort to bring macroeconomic policy into this social, environmental, political crisis, and be very creative about our economic models, and being able to capture what is to be, or could be seen as pessimism, but is more of a realistic approach to the world that we live in. So thank you very much to all the participants, and thank you very much for your attendance. And we wait, I think we have a break right now, and then we're gonna have our keynote speaker, Professor Rana Ray, who is already connected, and we will be here on the web at 12:15 p.m. See you back. Thank you very much.
segunda mesa de este seminario internacional. Estamos de manteles largos. El doctor Randall Ray aceptó nuestra invitación a presentar. Está haciendo todo un esfuerzo porque lo está haciendo a distancia, pero de todos modos agradecemos mucho que haya aceptado. Y por otro lado tenemos también a otro personaje que tiene gran trayectoria y que moderará esta mesa, la doctora Alicia Girón, profesora emérita de esta universidad. Nuevamente les damos la más cordial bienvenida y le damos la palabra a la doctora Girón. A menos que...
Well, to reiterate Claudia's message, I want to thank Professor Ray for his willingness to present in this event. And I do want to thank him and everybody in this room for your attention and willingness to participate in this seminar as well. I have fond memories with Professor Ray during my stay at University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I will give the microphone to Alicia Giron to introduce him.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really very happy to be here with Suzanne, especially with Claudia Maya and Carol Hill, my friends. And Claudia was my roomie when I had made a sabbatic many years ago in the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I was a student of Professor Randall, and also I'm here with Joel. So we are in family. Well, Randy, I'm very happy. Welcome to Mexico, and I'm going to invite you next year, and you have to accept for this is virtual, but this is the first invitation. But the second invitation is going to be between February and March, and I will send you a message during this week because we want you to come again to UNAM as many years before you have been here invited by Eugenia and me. So I'm going to read a short CV that is in the Levy page. Randall Ray is a professor of economics at the Levy Economic Institute of Bard College, and the 2022 and 2023 Tepola Distinguished Visiting Professor at Willamette University, Oregon. He is one of the developers of modern money theory, and his newest book on the topic is Making Money Work for Us, Polity, in November 2022. A companion illustrated guide to modern monetary theory will he release in May, Money for Beginners, and it is published with the Levy Institute graduate Hesk van Dumen Polity. He is they gave the Association for Revolutionary Economics the Wewell Common Award, and for his contribution to institutional thought. He has been a Fulbright scholar to Italy and Estonia, and a visiting professor at the University of Paris, Bologna, Bergen, Rome, UNAM in Mexico City, Unicamp in Brazil, Tallinn University in Estonia, Nankia University in China, and a visiting professor on a continuing basis at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. Well, hello, Randy, you have the floor. We will begin. Are we going to pass the?
I think he should be able to
How is my volume?
We can't hear him yet. I think he hasn't started.
Can you hear me? You can't hear me?
We don't hear.
Oh, no. Hold on.
Sí, ya fue por otra cosa.
How about now?
Perfect.
Okay, I don't know what went wrong, but this might work better anyway. So is the volume okay now?
Yes, it is okay.
Okay. Thanks for the invitation. And yes, I want to recognize that 4 of my former students are there on the panels and organizing things. Technically, Alicia was not a student, but a long-term friend and also
Well, I
recognized.
feel like a student because
Also,
I feel very young.
oh, okay. Also, Bill Waller, a longtime friend, so good to see him too. Let me share.
Okay, that's perfect.
Okay, is that up?
Yes, it is.
All right. I'm going to be looking at the relationship between economic growth and deficits and government debt. We're told all the time that chronic deficits and growing debt is unsustainable. Taken to the extreme, the debt ratio could explode. And you can work out through pretty simple math that a simplified version of the sustainability condition is that if the economic growth rate is greater than the interest rate the government pays on its debt, then it is sustainable. So we hear all the time politicians, mostly not economists, saying that, oh, we got to prevent deficits, we got to stop the debt from growing, we have to repay the debt, it's going to burden our grandkids, they're going to have to pay it all back. But as economists, we know that that's really not necessary. What is necessary is that the growth rate exceeds the interest rate. However, there are reasons from an orthodox perspective to think that a growing debt ratio is going to ensure that the interest rate exceeds the growth rate. Okay. And there are different angles taken by orthodox economists. The oldest one is the loanable funds argument, which sees the supply of loanable funds coming from saving, the demand for loanable funds coming from government borrowing or private borrowing by firms to finance investment. If the government is it's going to drive up the interest rate, that's going to reduce investment, that's going to lead to slower growth, and so we're not going to meet that sustainability condition. Or there's the Ricardian equivalence argument, which is that consumers are rational, and so they see a growing debt ratio. They know that in the future they're going to have to pay that all off. And so they stop spending, they increase saving, and that leads to slow growth. There also was the ISLM analysis that most people have gotten over by now, but that one focused on transactions crowding out, the demand for money going up against a fixed supply of money is going to push up the interest rate. And again, we get less investment, slower growth, and that will, again, lead to unsustainable growth of the deficit. There also is the fear that bond vigilantes might just boycott the bond market if the debt ratio continues to grow. And we would have to pay a higher interest rate to get them to come back in to the bond market. And so again, the interest rate goes up. So the takeaway from all of this is that we should expect that a rising deficit and debt ratios will be associated with higher interest rates and slower economic growth. And I'm going to turn to the data in just a bit. But there is an alternative view, which is we can call generic Keynesian, and that is that a budget deficit boosts demand, and so it could actually be associated with faster growth. They see the deficit as a countercyclical stabilizer. A rising deficit ratio could be associated with the growth that you get from a recovery. And furthermore, you could use the budget in a discretionary manner, fiscal policy in order to increase the growth rate. The danger is inflation. Okay, so now let's start looking at data. I'm going to present more data on the United States. I will present data on Mexico and other countries too. But let's start with the US. The debt ratio in the United States growing is not a new thing. Eric Tamoin has shown that since the founding of the nation, the debt ratio has grown at almost a 2% pace. So this is not growth of debt, it's growth of the debt to GDP ratio since 1791 through to 2018, which was the extent of his data for that paper. It grew at 1.82% per year. Now, we do notice that there's a break in the Great Depression. Up to the Great Depression, the debt ratio grew in 66 years and fell in 74, but still overall, there was positive growth of the ratio. Since the Great Depression, it's almost all one way. The debt ratio is almost always growing 83 years, and it grows at over 4% pace. So it's true that it grows much faster now. But the point is, it's been growing since 1791. If something continues for 250 years, more or less, you might start to think that it's sustainable. If something has gone on that long, it probably can continue for a few more years. Okay, MMT was mentioned. The MMT view of all of this is very different. Now, I'm not really going to be focusing on MMT theory here, but just to summarize the main points about the way that MMT proponents see this. If a currency, and if there's any questions about that, I can answer that later. Affordability is never in question. There's no risk of involuntary default, even if the interest rate was above the growth rate. You can still make all payments as they come due. Whether or not that's a good thing is a different question, but you can make the payments. MMT also adopts Ava Lerner's functional finance approach. The budget should serve a functional purpose, that is, to balance the private sector. Joelle touched on this. I will touch on it more in a minute. But rather than trying to balance the government's budget, what you want to do is use the budget to balance the private sector. So it's a very different view of what a good budget is. This is related to Wynne-Godley's sectoral balance approach. The budget outcome is largely not discretionary anyway. I will go into what that balance is. Again, Joelle touched on that and why it's not discretionary. MMT also adopts the endogenous money approach. The central bank sets the overnight interest rate. It is not set by markets. It is not set in the loanable funds market. It is not set in the ISLM diagram. The central bank can set the interest rate anywhere it wants. So it's very easy to keep the interest rate below the growth rate. The central bank just does it. That's all it takes. But generally, central banks target the short-term rate. Others are more complexly determined, and frequently treasuries issue bonds across the maturity spectrum, but the treasury can always issue at a short maturity. So with the central bank keeping the short-term rate low, the treasury can issue short-term bonds, or we call them BIs, keep the interest rate on the government debt below the growth rate, as long as the growth rate is a positive number. MMT argues that there's no such thing as a bond vigilante. If there's any vigilante, it's the central bank who pushes up the interest rates. We see bond sales not as a borrowing operation. Government does not need to issue bonds just because it is running a deficit. Bond sales serve a different purpose. The functional purpose is to drain bank reserves out of the system. They offer an interest earning alternative or higher interest earning alternative than reserves do. And so the banks will gladly buy the bonds. And then finally, we can turn to the evidence. Is there evidence that high deficits and debt raise interest rates and cause inflation? Well, let's first look at the country that is sort of the perfect test for this thesis, because it runs the biggest deficits and has the biggest debt ratio in the world, and that is Japan. Yeva Nersessian and I wrote a paper, I think about 4 years ago, looking at Japan and all of these questions applied to Japan. So I'll present some Japanese data. If we look at the blue line here, this is the government debt ratio, and you can see it increases consistently at a very fast pace since 1980 through to the present, and it's above 250% of GDP. Okay, so clearly the debt ratio is growing strongly. What do we expect? Well, this is supposed to cause inflation and drive up interest rates. The gray line is the 10-year interest rate, and you can see a very steady decline of the interest rate down to zero. Gets stuck at zero. So it's pretty clear that a rising debt ratio does not raise interest rates. Why is that? Well, because the Bank of Japan sets interest rates. And then finally, look at the inflation rate. And we see that inflation came down sharply to effectively an average of zero, with pretty significant deflation, and then counterbalanced by some periods in which it has inflation of about 1%, but consistently below the 2% the central banks have decided is the ideal number. So their problem was that they had deflation and inflation rates that were too low over this period. So clearly the data does not fit the theory of orthodoxy. Okay, so I said, well, we can just do an empirical test and ask Yeva to plot the debt ratio. So that is the vertical axis of Japan, the debt ratio relative to GDP against, the deficit ratio, not the debt ratio, deficit ratio relative to GDP against the growth rate of GDP. I really didn't know what it would look like, but what it looks like is a scatter plot. If you squint really hard, maybe you can sort of see a downward sloping relationship. But if we take, for example, a deficit ratio of, let's say, between 2 and 4%, we see that you can have virtually any growth rate is consistent with a deficit ratio between 2 and 4%. Okay, so there's no obvious negative relationship here, at least not a strong one. For this current presentation and a paper that will go with it, eventually it'll be at Levy. I forgot to mention that this particular presentation and paper is co-authored with a recent Bard graduate, Eric, who did this graph for me. I said, let's put in a bunch of countries. And so he grabbed all the ones that he could get data, reasonably good data, reasonably easily. Okay, so here we have a number of countries. And again, what you get is a scatter plot for this relationship between deficit ratios and GDP growth. Again, if we look at, say, moderate deficit ratio between 0 and 5, you can have any growth rate from a minus 10% to a positive 15%. Okay, so there is no obvious relationship, although maybe slightly downward. Okay, at least at the extremes. And so when I saw the scatter plots that Yeva had done, I thought, well, maybe we could draw a diagram, sort of the way that Laffer drew his on a cocktail napkin, but I drew it on a piece of scrap paper. We could think about there are two ways to get a budget deficit, the good way and the ugly way. So let's start at point A. We've got a relatively low deficit ratio. We've got moderate economic growth at point A. Then the economy goes into recession. What's going to happen? Well, with low growth, tax revenue goes down, and maybe some of the automatic spending stabilizers like unemployment compensation kicks up. We move from point A to point B. Now that high deficit is going to be putting more income into the economy than it out. By definition, that's what a deficit does. That helps the economy to start growing again. And so we could move to a point C with still a high deficit, but now we're growing fairly robustly. At point C, the tax revenue is going to be strong. And that is going to start reducing the budget deficit if we keep growing. And so we move to a point D, for example. Or alternatively, let's start at point A again. Okay, so we've got moderate growth and low budget deficit. President Biden gets elected and he says, we're going to build back better. We're going to spend trillions on infrastructure. We could go directly to point C. We're not going to stay at point C because with a high deficit ratio, the private sector is going to kick in and we're going to grow even faster. And that's going to increase tax revenue. And we're going to go to point D. Okay, so the first one I would call the ugly deficit. The second one is the good deficit. Okay, and so that's the way we can think about it. And that's why there's no obvious correlation, because those high deficits can be created in the good way or the ugly way. So then I asked Yeva, what if we connect the dots? What does it look like? And I really had no idea what it was going to look like. And it turns out there is a pattern that you will observe across every country. Let's start in 1980. Here we are in Japan. The 1980s were Japan's golden for a lot longer, but this really was the golden age of Japanese growth. Japan was taking over the world. In the United States, we were scared to death that Japan was going to take over and displace the United States. It's laughable when you think about it now, but it seemed plausible at the time. The Japanese bought New York City. They bought Hawaii. I think 17 out of the 20 biggest banks in the world were Japanese. We were really scared. Okay, so they're growing reasonably fast through the 80s. That fast growth is increasing tax revenue. The deficit is declining. And finally, at the end of the 80s, they move into a budget surplus. Now, that budget surplus is taking income out of the economy. The growth starts to slow. Now, it's also true the United States went into the first Bush recession, and it was our first recession in the post-war period that was called a jobless recovery. So even when we started recovering, it was not very robust. So as a net exporter, this hurt Japan. So that also, I'm not saying it was only the budget surplus that killed Japan. It also was the slower growth in the United States, probably. So we see the growth rate plummeting. Japan goes into a recession. The deficit starts to rise. They get a bit of a recovery. At the end of the 90s, the US has the dot-com bubble collapse, which affects Japan again. They go into recession. Deficit goes to 10% of GDP. They start to recover at the end of the 1990s. Okay, let's move to the next two periods. So if we start at 2000, here's 2000. So we're looking at the blue line, and they've got a high deficit. That high deficit is promoting economic growth. The US is doing reasonably well. You see they do a loop-to-loop, but they continue to grow at about a 2% pace. The deficit ratio is coming down. And then the US goes into the global financial collapse. That affects Japan. the deficit ratio climbs up to 10% of GDP. They begin to recover, and then they repeat the loops going down with the deficit ratio declining, economic growth positive but very low, until the COVID recession, deficit ratio goes up close to 10%. They start to recover, and so on. Okay, so that's what we find in the case of Japan. What about the United States? So here is the scatter plot for the United States. Sort of looks like the Japanese scatter plot, although here it's even harder to squint as much as you want and see a downward sloping curve. It just doesn't look like we have one of those for the United States. And we see again that at a growth rate of 2 to 4%, sorry, at a deficit ratio of 2 to 4%, you can have any growth rate, okay, across the spectrum. It does say it excludes outliers. This excludes World War II when our deficit ratio reached 25% of GDP. So though that huge number is not included in here. Otherwise, it would be, the whole scale would be all messed up. Okay, let's do the loop-de-loop for the United States. Just going to focus on the post-2000 period, the COVID crisis. So we start here. We're in the second Bush Jr. recession in 2001. We had a budget surplus that was inherited from President Clinton. A budget surplus that turns into a deficit. The economy recovers from that early 2000 recession. We grow fairly rapidly until the global financial crisis. Our deficit was coming down right before the crisis. We go into the global financial crisis. The deficit goes to 10%. We recover. And then we see a slow downward trend of the deficit ratio with moderate economic growth until COVID. And then the deficit ratio goes to 15%. We recover, fastest recovery ever, strongest recovery ever. And we end up with the deficit coming back down. Okay, so again, we see the loop-de-loop associated with recession and recovery. So now focusing in on the counter-cyclical nature, the automatic stabilizing nature of the government's balance. Going back to World War II, we can see that the deficit ratio goes down, okay, down before every recession. So if you want to try to predict recessions, I think one of the best predictors, maybe the best predictor, is a reduction of the deficit ratio. Every deficit reduction, every recession increases the deficit ratio. And then it begins to come down. It goes up very sharply in recession, and then it gradually goes down in recovery. So it's quicker going up in recession than it is coming down in the expansion. We can look at what contributes to the deficit. There are two kinds of automatic stabilizers. One is taxes, because a lot of taxes are linked to sales or income. And so in recession, tax revenues go down sharply. And then the other automatic stabilizer is mostly your social welfare system, so transfer payments. So if we look over time, we see that before the mid-90s, generally speaking, deficits are created by both of those things. They're created by the transfer payments, which are blue, that always go up with a recession. You notice that they lag the recession. As people fall into poverty, gradually they become eligible for welfare, and that will increase spending. on transfer payments. So those were an automatic stabilizer, helped us recover. And then the tax revenue, as we already saw, is declining sharply in recession. But notice from the mid-90s, the automatic stabilizer transfer payments is very weak. And this is thanks to Bill Clinton, who ended welfare in the United States. And we still have unemployment compensation, but most people who lose their jobs don't qualify. So it's not a very good stabilizer. On the other hand, tax revenue becomes much more volatile. When we go into recession, it literally drops off a cliff now. And I've done some research into this to try to figure it out, that it's the massive increase of inequality that accounts for this. It's not really the taxes paid by working people. It's taxes paid by Wall Street type people that plummets in recession and then booms in an expansion. Okay, and just finally, let's focus on the global financial crisis because that one was very big and tax revenue really fell. Here you can see it's falling at a 25% per quarter rate. That's really falling off a cliff when we go into the global financial crisis recession. Transfer payments, again, don't do much for stabilizing the economy. They do go up with a lag, okay, but not nearly, they don't rise nearly as much as tax revenue fell. And then finally, consumption type spending by government, we could think of this as more discretionary. It actually goes down. So it appears as if the increase of the deficit induces the government to actually do less, okay, less discretionary spending, which sort of makes sense if you understand the Starians who formulate the budget in the United States. Okay, so that is one way of looking at what's going on and looking at the automatic stabilizers. The other way at getting at this is using Godley's sectoral balance approach. Again, Joel mentioned this. So this is a different kind of constraint from the budget sustainability constraint. This is the constraint imposed on the government by sectoral balances, because at the aggregate level, balances have to balance, okay? So it's the sum of the private sectors, private domestic sectors balance. So this is firms and households taken as a whole. The government sector, this is all levels of government, but the federal government dominates this because its budget is able to swing more than state and local government budgets. In the United States, essentially all the states are supposed to submit balanced budgets. And then finally, the foreign sector. The sum of those has to equal zero. When Godley used the flow of funds data, we don't have that for many countries. And so it's typical to simplify it as the government's budget balance, which is government spending less taxes, plus the private sector. And so here, really, we calculate this as a residual. It's investment minus saving. And then finally, plus the foreign balance, net exports. The sum of those has to be zero. The government's balance, plus the private sector's balance, plus the balance with the rest of the world, or net exports, is zero. If your external balance is zero, in other words, if you're a closed economy, before Reagan, the US was just about a closed economy for the purposes here. Then a government deficit means the private sector has a surplus. Okay, so that is the balance constraint for a closed economy. Now that the US runs a persistent current account deficit, the private sector cannot run surplus. It cannot net save without a government deficit. And that government deficit has to be deficit to let the private sector save. So here's the United States. The red is the government sector taken as a whole. This includes state and local governments, but as I said, the swings of this have more to do with the federal government, not the state government. And what we see is it's virtually always below the line. You probably can't even see the surplus. It is right here. That's during the Clinton years. So for a few years, we had a budget surplus that was big enough and long enough to show up here. We had a few other quarterly surpluses. They weren't long enough to show up on this graph. So that is the one exception where the federal government ran a budget surplus. The black is the domestic private sector, and you can see that that virtually is always positive. If I had superimposed the recessions, what you would see is every time there's a spike here in private sector saving, that is a recession. Okay, here's the COVID recession. Here is the global financial, whoops, sorry, after the global financial crisis. This is the saving. So recessions cause the private sector to retrench. They want to spend less, save more. And the government deficit is the main thing that offsets that. Finally, the blue is the foreign sector. So this is the balance against the rest of the world. And so it's from the rest of the world's perspective, which means when it's above the line, the rest of the world is running a surplus. We're running a net export deficit. You can see that the US used to have small until the 80s. Since the 80s, we always have current account deficits. Some of these things have to be equal, and your eyes are telling you this is a mirror image, which it has to be by identity, because the balances do balance. You can see that how phenomenally big the response to the global financial crisis was, to the COVID crisis was. Together, Presidents Trump and Biden provided $5 trillion in COVID relief. And so we see a huge increase in the government's deficit and a huge increase in private saving, which gradually mostly got spent. The savings accumulated from the relief checks. And that helped us to recover quickly. Okay, what about Mexico? Now, I'm not an expert on Mexico, but I did want to present some of the same sort of data for Mexico. So we'll look at the period since 1990. And what we're going to see is that Mexico had relatively rapid growth early on that produced a budget surplus in 1991. Economic growth slowed, pushed the economy into a deep recession. A budget deficit was restored by 1993. It's been in deficit ever since. Mexico's growth appears to be strongly influenced by the US. That is not surprising, I'm sure, to anybody. The global financial crisis caused a deep recession and a growing deficit that generated recovery by 2010. By 2015, the strong to fall sharply, and growth slowed to just 2%. The COVID recession increased the budget deficit, and that seems to have helped recovery. So here is the plot of the 1990s. We start here with a deficit ratio of about 3% and strong growth. The strong growth seems to have reduced the budget deficit, generated a surplus. The surplus slowed the economy a bit, but then there's a deep recession. Now, as I already said, the US had the Bush senior recession. And so I suspect that that had something to do with Mexico's recession. The deficit goes up, the economy recovers, and you do a loop. Okay. From 2000 to 2010, we see the deficit going up and economy slowing to produce what is a big deficit for Mexico, would not be big for the United States, of 4%. The economy recovers by the end of 2010. So the global financial crisis fed through to Mexico. And then from 2010, the deficit declines a bit, but we more or less are reducing the deficit as the economy grows at a relatively slow pace until the global financial crisis, the COVID crisis, and the deficit goes back up to 4. And the economy recovers along with the global economy. And so we end up back with a deficit ratio of about 4. What about the sectoral balances? In the early 90s, Mexico was a big importer. It had big domestic private sector deficits, small budget deficits, and even that short-lived surplus. From the mid-90s to the 2000s, we had smaller net imports, smaller budget deficits, and small domestic private saving. From 2010 through COVID, we had bigger net imports, bigger budget deficits, bigger domestic private saving. And after COVID, net exports turned into small net imports, big budget deficits, and big domestic saving. So here we are. The foreign sector is running a surplus against Mexico. Mexico's a net importer, with the exception here. And the government sector is running deficits with the exception there. The domestic private sector was net spending, but otherwise net savers. Okay, so those are the sectoral balances. What are the implications for discretion over the government's budget? Well, given the private sector's desire to accumulate saving, the United States and other importers, including Mexico, have to run larger budget deficits, all else equal, to account for the foreign surpluses and still allow the domestic private sector to net save. So in a sense, bigger deficits are baked in for countries that are importers by the foreign sector's desire to accumulate net dollar assets. In the case of the United States, desire for net dollar assets is huge, maybe insatiable. What that means is that for any level of desired domestic saving and for any given level of growth of GDP, the implied size of the deficit of the United States government has grown along with the size of its current account deficit. So what I'm saying is, if you believe that your domestic private sector has any discretion over whether to spend and save, or if you believe the foreign sector has discretion, say in the case of the United States, do foreigners have the discretion to try to save dollars? Then what that means is the government does not have discretion. To the extent the other sectors have discretion, the government has no discretion. Okay, so the way I see it is that especially a net importer, you don't really have any discretion over your budget. The budget balances the economy. And this is the functional finance approach. They say that's the way you should look at the budget balance. You're trying to balance the economy, not balance the budget. The problem for a net importer like the United States and Mexico is that the benefits of your government deficit leak out of your economy. They support foreign saving desires. So the US is supporting the world's desire to save dollars by running our current account deficit and keeping our budget deficit big. Or if we look at the Gillespie profit equation, our current account deficit is supporting the rest of the world's profits. Is adding to foreign profits. It's not surprising that our deficits and our debt ratios have tended to rise since the mid-80s as the US transitioned to become a big net importer, so that our deficits are supporting the rest of the world's saving desires and the rest of the world's profits. Okay, well, if you believe all of that, what about a net exporter? The current account surpluses support domestic saving and profits. So all things equal, if you run a current account surplus, your domestic firms and households can save more and you get higher profits. But how can we explain what happened to Japan? Because they're a net exporter. Why do they have such huge budget deficits? It should be easy for them to balance their government budget because they are net exporters, unlike the US and unlike Mexico. Well, here is Japan's sectoral balance. And for the purposes of this one, you can have as many sectors as you want. And we chose to use 4 for this graph. So we have households as blue, corporations as orange. So we split the private sector into households versus firms. And what we see is that in the golden age of Japan, the 80s, households were huge savers. I think Japan and Italy had the highest household saving rate in the world. So they're saving about 10% of GDP. What about corporations? They are net spenders, okay? Huge net spenders. So they are investing in the economy to produce sort of the Japanese export miracle. They're investing, okay? And that allows households to save. The government, well, the government was running a deficit until the end of the 80s, but all of this rapid growth actually produced some surpluses. Okay, so the government ran a surplus at the end of the 80s. And the rest of the world, well, that's pretty constant. You can see that Japan is always a net exporter. Okay, yes, it got bigger, but it remains pretty robust as a net exporter. So what happened was that the corporations shifted in this period right here to become net savers. So after 97, with private firms becoming net savers, they're not investing much anymore, you get slower economic growth. The slower growth affects the tax revenue. So budget deficits tend to be higher. Household saving fell considerably at the end of the 90s, and again in 2008 when it fell below 0. So you can see here's the household saving, huge. It becomes pretty small after that. Although it increased as the global financial crisis spread around the world, households also tightened their belts, tried to increase saving to deal with the downturn. So for Japan, what's the solution? Every time Japan recovers, they impose some new consumption tax because they want to try to reduce the deficit and retire some debt. But all that does is kill the recovery. So what? More investment to produce for domestic consumption and more security, especially old age security, to reduce the saving rates of the private sector. Okay, finally, let's turn to another net exporter, Singapore. And I'm not going to go through all these. The point I wanted to make is, okay, so here is a big net exporter. But this is a country that runs budget surpluses. And that's why it has the loop-de-loops, but they are below the line. In other words, budget surpluses, except for the global financial crisis. Okay, so that produced a budget deficit from which they recovered. All right, but anyway, this is what a strong net exporter could look like if they have rapid enough growth. Repeat this picture, which I already showed. So this is all the countries combined. And it does look like there's a slight negative slope. So what we decided to do is to produce a table where we take each of the countries individually and we define what an ugly deficit looks like and what a good deficit looks like. We use two different measures for the good deficit. So an ugly deficit is when you have slow growth and a growing deficit for 3 or more years. Okay, except for China and Singapore, every country has at least one ugly deficit. And well, France has 4 of them. And Mexico has 2. But you see that ugly deficits are pretty common. What about good deficits? That is with rising growth and a growing deficit. So this is Biden's Build Back Better. You can see not nearly as many of them. Quite a few countries don't have any, and no country has 2. So we said, well, let's make it a little easier to achieve it. Let's just say growing deficit for 2 years and rising growth. Okay, then the bar is lower. You get more countries that have 2 of those. But again, you can see there are more ugly deficits than there are good deficits, which is what your eyeball is telling you when you look at this. There are more ugly ones. That is true. Bad deficits dominate. Let's look at a period 2000 to 2010 as an iconic example. Why iconic? Well, global financial crisis. So most countries went through this. They got bad deficits. Most countries had low deficits and good growth at the beginning. The global financial crisis collapsed growth and led to high deficits. The USA and Euroland area did have discretionary spending to boost economic growth, and recovery saw deficits decline and growth increasing. So here I just put 6 countries here just to show you that things are pretty similar, and it sure looks like there are strong linkages. Here is the UK, the United States, Canada. They look very, very similar. You get a little more idiosyncratic behavior when we look south of the border. Brazil seems to be less linked to the United States. Mexico seems to be strongly linked to the United States. And then we have the Japanese example. But anyway, the loop-de-loop sort of behavior is very common. And with that, I will stop and take questions.
Thank you very much, Randy. You have many important things, especially one of the most important things, especially for the economic policy in Mexico, is how to manage the deficits and also the good and the bad deficit that are related with the growth of the economy. We have been since we signed the UMSCA agreement, or before the free trade agreement, we have closed our economy to the policy of the Federal Reserve, especially with the interest rate, because as we had been studied, and Claudia remembers that in the 14th chapter of the first agreement, it's supposed that we must not go more than no more than 10% in inflation, no more the interest rate has been no more than, it was at 3 or 4%, and also the, ¿cómo se llama? El tipo de cambio, the exchange rate. So, and that has been like, how to say, like a camisa de fuerza, like a straight jacket for the Mexican economy. And even if we have had, well, more employment, one of the principal aims of this government, of this new government, is to have more employment, but also to change that. Maybe if we will like to have a better type of life, they have to change at least the monetary policy. Well, with all this reflection and your conference, I would put the floor if someone would like to make some questions. Also, Carol or Claudia, if you want to make a question, go ahead. We have 15 minutes before we have to close this session. Who would like to make some questions? Yes, Jose, the microphone. Maybe if you come here. Yeah, okay.
¿En inglés o en español?
In English.
Hello, Dr. Ray. Big fan of your work. A question of MMT, well, a critique, a frequent critique to modern money theory is that it can only be applied to the United States, right? And it's on institutional arrangement of monetary institutions, which is kind of funny for me because in Mexico, monetary institutions like the equivalent of the Treasury and the central bank work in really similar ways. As the Treasury in the United States, here in Mexico, we also have a general fund, la cuenta única, la tesorería. And central bank decisions relies mostly on autonomy, relies mostly on interest rates targeting, right? So what will be your, since it's, I would dare to say, which with no authority to say it, but I would dare to say that at institutional level, when government spends in Mexico, savings in the banking sector increases, and when treasury tax savings accounts in banks decreases, just as an MMT consistent view would say. But the problem or the general question about that is how it affects, since institutional arrangement, it could be the same, but geographically and politically, the situations in Mexico are really different. Deficits here are really, they are really critiqued, especially in these times with a record high one. But how those limitations outside of these institutional ones, and also institutional ones, but how prepares Mexico for high deficits and high GDP growth perspectives are for you? Thank you.
Okay. Oh,
Okay,
you want more
Randy.
than one?
Yes, I do. Dr. Ray, I'm just in any discourse from our politicians when they talk about austerity as a political promise means that they're going to take the economy to face a depression or a recession. So how it became so popular? So why politicians and other economists doesn't understand this, that to balance economy doesn't, no, to functional finance is about a balance, when it seems so sentido común, so natural, so.
Okay. So please, Randy, I give you the floor.
Okay. So what kinds of countries does MMT apply to? It applies to countries that issue their own currency, that have governments that issue debt only in their own currency, and who don't promise to convert their currency at some fixed exchange rate to either gold or to US dollars. Okay. Then many of the things that MMT says will apply, whether they issue an international reserve currency or not. They clearly do face more constraints, but they don't face a constraint over how much of their own currency can they spend domestically. Okay. If you have 50% of your population that's unemployed or underemployed, they want your currency. They want a job where they can earn your currency. Okay? So you know that you can employ them. So one of the conclusions MMT makes is that if you issue your own currency, you can always afford full employment at home. Okay, so it's a matter of making the commitment to provide the jobs, and putting in place what is necessary to supervise the new employees, and you want them to do something useful to help the country develop and to develop its own independence. You know, because you studied at UMKC, I don't do development economics, but there are MMT proponents who do, who are experts on this. And one of your classmates, Fidel Kabub, explains that most developing countries have severe shortage, or let's say lack of ability to produce food and energy. Okay, so those are the two areas where they are very constrained in being able to produce enough food and energy. So it makes sense to try to employ people to increase your capacity to provide those two things to the extent that you're able to do that. Even if the central bank is fighting against you and raising the interest rate like the Fed is doing right now in the United States, we can still make all the payments on the debt. And Mexico can still make all the payments on peso denominated debt. Now, you all remember that there was a period in which Mexico was issuing dollar denominated debt. So everything I'm saying does not apply if you issue debt in a foreign currency. You may not be able to make those payments. You may be forced to default or to renegotiate the terms of the debt because you can't make those because they're in dollars. So issuing debt in a foreign currency is going to expose you to the possibility you might have to default on the debt commitments, which creates problems. But we know Latin American countries often do default on debt. And usually all the supposed bad impacts from defaulting on debt don't come to pass. So default could be an option that would help you get out of it. But the best thing is try to avoid doing it. What I'm saying wouldn't apply to firms, domestic firms, if they want to issue debt in dollars. As long as the government doesn't guarantee that debt, then bankruptcy is an option for domestic firms. The process for spending is the same in a country like Mexico or Brazil as it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. So the person who asked the question raised this point: isn't Mexico's process of sovereign spending the same? Yes, it's the same. Okay. And yes, it is subject to the central bank's decisions over where to set the interest rate. Okay, so that was correct. The process of spending is the same. It will lead to an increase of bank reserves. So when the Treasury spends, bank reserves go up in Mexico, in Brazil, in the United States, in the UK. That's what happens. And then the bond sales drain those reserves out. They offer a higher interest earning alternative to reserves. So the description of how the government really spends, which was really the first project that MMT undertook, Stephanie Kelton, Scott Fulweiler, Eric Des Moines, all did that for the United States. And we've had students at UMKC and then at the Levy Institute who have done it for their own countries, including Brazil fairly recently, about 3 years ago. Another student did it for Brazil. Find out it's the same. Okay, the operations are the same. Now, in addition to the central bank raising interest rates and possibly fighting against government trying to overcome austerity, you face real resource constraints. Mexico, fortunately, is very rich in resources. So you don't really face a lot of resource constraints. And you have an abundance of people who know that. We see them coming into the United States to get jobs. So clearly, if you provided more jobs in Mexico, you've got people to fill those positions. So the problem is that there's an apparent lack of will, lack of understanding that you can create jobs for the people who are trying to get out of Mexico in order to find jobs in the United States. And you're rich in natural resources too. So the case of Mexico, the resource constraints are not that severe compared to many other countries in the world that may not have the natural resource constraints and a few may not have the labor resources. Okay, why the austerity? It could be that it benefits some. Austerity and high unemployment rates are beneficial to some. Labor is cheap. Domestic labor is cheap. And so that keeps the costs of hiring workers down if there's lots of unemployment. So some do benefit from austerity. And I think you have to take that into account when you try to fight against austerity. And then finally, there are the economists who give advice. And since the vast majority of economists are all mainstream, and they accept some version of loanable funds theory or some version of the old ISLM model or some version of the new monetary consensus that sees the main problem as being effective demand is always too high. Okay, you know, that's the basis of the consensus. You have a demand gap, but by demand gap, they mean demand is too high. So they're always biased toward austerity. So the additional problem is that the economists giving advice all come out of those traditions that see the potential is always biased toward inflation, and you need to keep demand down to prevent inflation. And the way you do that is by budget austerity and high interest rates. Okay, then the last point is that most countries do face the danger of exchange rate movements. In the case of the United States, as I said, I think the demand for US dollars is almost insatiable. I think we can run huge current account deficits, much bigger than what we have now, with very little impact on the dollar exchange rate. That's not true for everybody. And it could be that implementing a job guarantee program, employing more of your population, will increase your imports and could negatively impact the exchange rate. And I know your exchange rate is down at about 20 to the dollar. And you have to decide how negative is that impact on your economy. I think that there are some benefits to the exchange rate declining. It may help you turn around that trade balance. In the case of the United States, it doesn't work. But in the case of Mexico, it could make Mexican output cheaper and allow you to turn that around. Then there also is one other alternative, and that is trying to restrain imports. And I know it's not fashionable anymore to talk about trade restriction, but I think that if you're a developing country in danger of significant impacts on your exchange rate, then it makes sense to say, you know what, we shouldn't be importing BMWs and Mercedes. Okay, keep them out. So I think that is a way to increase employment at home, try to develop your economy without worrying about your exchange rate. So I know that was long, but I'll stop. I didn't address much about other countries, I know, and I just wanted to go through some of the ideas.
Randy, thank you very much. And the comparison that you have made between USA, Japan, and Mexico, I think it was very interesting, especially because not only how has been implemented the economic development in our countries, but especially because while I was making a paper about the global gender gaps between Mexico and Japan, we saw that in the macroeconomic indicators, Japan is, of course, it has a big, how to say, big investment in health, in education, and Mexico is the opposite. But because there is a cultural problem with Japanese women, and we don't have that problem with the Mexican woman, the global gender gap in Mexico, we pass from the 60 or 70 level to the I think that the last point was we were in between the 13 and 15, while Japan is 120. It was very impressive, these numbers. But also, I think that the monetary policy has to be very close to reduce the gender gaps, especially if we have more employment that increase not only employment for women, but also for men, and especially other things that we in Mexico, they have already created a proposition because it hasn't been approved of a care system. And I think also one of the things to have more employment besides health, education, infrastructure, also the care system is very important, not only for Mexico, for Japan, and also for USA, because at least and for Europe is also very important because now people are getting older, and now we have to take care of the elders, for the children, for the uncles, for the family. And that's also one of the things that we must, a way to increase employment. And of course, all the policies of the New Deal are very important as a lesson to improve employment. Randy, maybe we could talk a little bit more, but I hope you will accept the invitation to come next year at the end of February and March, and we will have, but here in Mexico, not by Zoom. Because no, so, and I think also Claudia invites your colleagues, my colleagues, as Carol, Joel, no, all of them that are here, and also with our students. Thank you very much, Randy, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. See you soon.
Muy bien, gracias.